Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I want to talk about a topic that very rarely do you ever hear anyone talk about, and that is jointed crankbaits, jointed hard baits. Outside of the glide baits and like hard swim bait realm, there are not that many jointed baits on the market. As an example, this is a Rapala Rattling Shad Wrap jointed bait right here. This was, in my opinion, one of the first jointed baits on the market. Rapala's been making jointed floating Rapalas. This is a bomber long A that's jointed, but they're minnow style baits. But there aren't that many crankbaits out there that are jointed. And I have a couple of ideas behind that. One is I think they generally don't work as well as a straight, hard bodied crankbait. But there are times and places where I truly feel like a jointed crankbait, whatever it is, really can outshine other baits. So that's what I want to address today. I kind of want to get into some of the background, some of my personal experiences, and then talk about when I think that they can outproduce a standard, full bodied, unjointed crankbait. Before I do get into that, I do want to remind you guys, though, that I do have an affiliate link with Tackle Warehouse. So if you want to support the channel and you're looking to purchase some tackle, please use my link. I'll put that in the video description. I also have a members only page where we do additional monthly videos, a monthly live stream, as well as direct contact to me if you have questions. And that's all through my members only page within the YouTube channel. So check that out as well. All right, so a little bit of background on my history with respect to jointed crankbaits. When I was younger, I'm talking when I was in my teens, one of my favorite baits was a straight Rapala Shad Wrap. And I would catch a ton of fish on that. I would throw it almost everywhere. I got to the point where it was the most versatile bait I threw because I caught fish on it regardless of what I was fishing. Could have been dirty river water, could have been gin clear, weed filled lakes. The point is, I really was catching a lot of fish. And one of the reasons I liked it so much is it was an extremely uh, versatile bait that caught almost everything that swam. I would catch pike, muskie, walleye, largemouth, smallmouth, perch, crappie, you name it, you could catch it on a Shad Wrap. It is an outstanding bait. So when they came out with the jointed, this is the Rattling one, but a jointed Shad Wrap, I was all about it. I went out, bought a pile of them, and I got to tell you, I was not extremely impressed right off the bat. And it took me a while to kind of figure out when the jointed one would outproduce the non-jointed version. And what I've done with that is since I honed that in when I was younger, I've been able to apply that now to other baits that are jointed, whether they're crankbaits or stick baits or jerk baits, whatever you want to call them. And I've realized that there definitely is a time and a place when the jointed bait outproduces the non-jointed. The thing is, there's so few on the market that we very rarely hear anyone talking about them. It's not like you read articles about when to use jointed, when to use non-jointed. So I thought it would be a good topic because I like jointed baits, but I also feel like I have a much better idea as to when to throw them. And if you don't, you're probably gonna, if you're just out there winging them around, you might recognize that they don't produce always better than the other crankbaits or hard baits. So let's get into it a little bit to go about it. So just to wrap up my story, when I was younger, what I recognized was the fact that even though you think a jointed bait is bigger, louder, brasher, because there's more moving parts, the reality behind it is they produce less water displacement because the back end just kind of follows in behind the rest of the bait. It would be similar to coasting behind a big truck on the highway. You get better gas mileage if you're behind the big truck because the big truck's creating a draft. Well, the back end of your bait is also in a draft when you have a jointed bait like that, especially with a crankbait style bait. Versus a straight bait, if you've got a straight bait with no joint, when it wiggles side to side, it actually is pushing more water to both sides. So, from that standpoint, the fish have a better idea of your bait being there when you're using a non jointed bait. The same thing can be said for, if you want a good example of it, take a standard, say a bomber long A, and use it as a wake bait on the water. If you retrieve a solid straight bodied one what you'll see is the V it produces is much larger than the jointed one because the joint is following behind it. So your V is only coming off this section versus the entire bait, which is what you get with a non-jointed bomber long A. So you can actually see the water displacement based on the V that's being created by it, and it is much smaller with a jointed bait. Now that's the key. You need to understand that because that's where I figured out when to throw the jointed versus non-jointed. The jointed baits actually act better in those scenarios where you've got extremely clear water, where you've got skittish fish. It's better for those fish that are just more wary. So for me, I'm going to try to throw a jointed bait if I have the ability, if I'm fishing cold clear water. A lot of times those fish are not nearly as active. That's one of the reasons people say to throw a shad wrap as in general during that time, or your flat-sided balsa cranks, is because they don't produce huge wobbling motion. Well, if you're creating less water displacement with a jointed bait, that falls in line with that theory of using a bait that is much more uh, less bulky or brash, right? You're trying to find something that is really just coming through the water column, not trying to draw a ton of fish to it based on the noise and the wiggle motion. You're just trying to get those lethargic fish to react to a much more natural presentation. So cold clear water is one. I also really like to throw them in warm clear water. And the reason for that is if I've got post front days during the summer months where the fish are not reacting well to a crankbait because of the fact that we've got those post front conditions, I have found that I do better switching down to the jointed crankbait during that time period because it is less invasive. It's not nearly as big and brash, like I said. So it's almost like finessing down your crankbait. So if you've got post front conditions, and I really like it in the summer months because that's when they still are much more in tune with hitting a crankbait versus if you had big post front conditions potentially during, say, the pre spawn period. So that's a time I like to do it. I also like to do it anytime I'm fishing high pressured bodies of water. If I know there's a bunch of guys out there throwing crankbaits that are just beaten up everywhere, that's when I like to go with a bait that's jointed because it's something the fish haven't seen. It's creating that less movement. It's not giving the fish nearly as much notice that it's there. They should not be as wary to it. So if you're on a lake that gets a ton of crankbait pressure, try throwing a jointed crankbait in those time periods. The last time I'm going to point out too, or the last time I like to do it, and this kind of goes a little bit against what I was saying before, is if you do have a crankbait like this Jackall Aragon, which has a lot of rattles and has really good thumping motion side to side. This is a little bit different than a lot of other jointed crankbaits, which really are not necessarily meant to whack the sides of the front portion to create noise. Uh, I like to throw them around rock if I'm in dirtier water. So even though I'm getting less displacement side to side, because this bait is just clunking off the sides of the bait, that loud sound echoes off the rocks, which creates more commotion. So from the standpoint of trying to create more noise, which I think is better around rock because you get better sound uh, travel through the water, I do like to throw, if you've got a crankbait like the Jackal Aragon here that will thump back and forth, I do think that that can be a very good sound to have when fishing around rock. And that's a sound you can't get if you're fishing around rock with a straight baited, unjointed crankbait. So that's something to keep in mind too. It's just a different sound that you're creating, and that goes back in line with if you're fishing pressured water where people are throwing crankbaits all the time. If you can create a different sound, something the fish haven't seen before, it's worth using. So I'll put the link for some of the jointed crankbaits I like to use in the video description if that's something that interests you. But don't rule them off. Just because we don't hear that many people talking about jointed crankbaits does not mean that they don't catch fish. Like I said at the beginning of this, I don't think they're as good as a unjointed crankbait if you could only choose one, but there are definitely times where they will outproduce a non-jointed crankbait. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video tip for you tomorrow.